And joining us now on the line from Montreal, Quebec, Paul Martin, Canada's 21st Prime Minister and Minister of Finance from 1993 to 2002. And Mr. Martin, as I welcome you back to the program, I guess I should start by saying happy anniversary. You became PM 7 years ago this week, so happy anniversary.
Well, good for you. What? All right, well, thank you for that.
What do you mean good for me? You mean you didn't remember that?
What? I didn't remember it. I certainly remember when it happened. I didn't remember the exact week, so there you go.
Okay, happy anniversary and moving right along. Listen, I know that when you're Minister of Finance, the circumstances in Canada were not quite what they are today in Ireland, which we've just talked about with Professor Kennedy, but some of this has got to have been reminiscent for you. So when you heard the news, Ireland, the IMF, the bondholders are coming, what was the reaction that went through your head?
Well, obviously that was one of my biggest fears, if not the biggest, when I was finance minister. I was very, very worried that we were close to the tipping point and that some international crisis would come along and would hit us and actually would tip us over. And in fact, as you know, just 2 months before we presented the budget that eventually led to the elimination of the deficit, we got hit by the Mexican peso crisis. And of course, the same herd effect that you're seeing taking place in Europe right now, you know, as the bond market took control of people's sovereignty, skated us very badly offside. Our interest rates went through the roof. But fortunately, we came through it. And by the time the Asian crisis occurred, of course, we had basically dealt with the issue.
Let me read you something that was in the Vancouver Sun last week. And this deals, again, with the Irish situation and a lot of the issues of nationalism and sovereignty that the Irish are having to deal with today. Here's an excerpt from the piece. James Connolly, a hero of Irish independence, was shot to death by a British firing squad for his role in Ireland's 1916 uprising for home rule. He died for his belief that hoisting an Irish flag over the capital meant little if England still ruled, quote, through her landlords, through her financiers, through the whole army of commercial and individual institutions, close quote. He was right. The stakes are high. Political backlash from austerity measures is threatening the most recent plan to recapitalize insolvent banks with tens of billions of euros. Investors want their money back, and Ireland's regulatory free-for-all of the past decade meant that much of the money on the block that came from Americans and Europeans. It's no surprise, then, that they are leading the charge for repayment. Can you help us understand this whole push-me-pull-you, if you like, between those who are nationalistic and who want to see a country be able to exercise its own sovereignty, but knowing that sovereignty, when you owe that much money, just ain't what it used to be?
Well, you know, I am primarily of Irish descent, and I can certainly remember all of the discussions around the dinner table with my grandfather and grandmother about issues just like this. And so I understand how much in Ireland this is an emotional issue. But I think that I want to put this in perspective. I think it is a sovereignty issue. I think that, and that's one of the reasons it was so important that we in Canada acted, because when the markets take over, they then end up dictating your social policy. And understand, the markets aren't a bunch of unknown speculators. They're pension funds, you know, they're large financial institutions, the people that control other people's savings, and they're not trying to destroy your sovereignty, but they are trying to get their money back. And that does have a huge effect on the ability of a government to control its own destiny. I watched the earlier segment of your show. I don't really believe that what Ireland is going through in the first instance is what's damaging their sovereignty. Don't forget, in the middle 50s, the United Kingdom was in front of the IMF. It was only, you know, 10, 12 years ago during the Asian crisis that Korea, for instance, which is the 13th biggest economy in the world, was in fact had the IMF at its doors. The real problem that's occurred here is that effectively Irish taxpayers, Irish working people, are now having to transfer their money, not simply to fund an Irish bank, but in fact to make sure that European banks, that United Kingdom banks, don't have to basically pick up the shortfall for their bad bets. The real problem that's occurring, and Ireland is a pawn in this, is that in fact the Europeans, instead of doing what the Americans did and stress testing their banks and making them recapitalize, the Europeans didn't do it. And so what you're now seeing is French banks and German banks who can't stand another hit, who should be taking a hit on the Irish bank's debt, are not doing it, and Irish workers are being asked to take that hit, and that's going to last for a decade, and that's the real attack, I think, on Ireland. And I think that a lot of wrong decisions have been taken.
Well, let's focus on that Irish taxpayer for a second. Is there any other alternative other than the events that have taken place, the decisions that have been taken by the government of Ireland over the past week or so, that could have been brought to bear during this crisis?
Oh, sure. You know, I mean, the Irish debt has gone up, national debt's gone up by over a third because of this bailout, because they refuse to have the bondholders of these Irish banks, the senior bondholders, who are essentially European banks, face up to the results of what were very bad decisions. You're going to see before this is all over. You're going to see a restructuring of sovereign debt in Europe. You're going to see certainly a restructuring of bank debt, and they should be facing up to this next year. You've got sovereign debt coming due, and you've got massive bank debt coming due, and they're going to be out there competing for what is, in fact, you know, a lot of reluctant money. And who's being asked to bear the brunt of this? It really is, it's the Irish working man and woman.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. It sounds like they're the ones who are being asked to take a haircut here rather than the former, rather than the bank debt or the sovereign debt.
Yeah, you've said it very well. And there's a problem. You know, there's no doubt that countries have to face up to their liabilities and they shouldn't be able to walk away from them. But you've got to ask yourself, really, where is this all going to end? The Irish government is asking its people to bear tremendous austerity. They're reducing benefits, which help people. They are raising taxes. Well, you know, if you do that too much, what happens is the government's revenues start to dry up, because if you're not working and you're having to pay higher taxes, then in fact that leads to a lessening of your revenues. And you do that over a couple of cycles, and in fact you're going to increase your deficit. You're not going to decrease it. I think that governments have to face up to their issues, but bailing out those Irish banks, in my opinion, was not the right thing to do, because it simply made the Irish a pawn in a much larger European game in which the European governments themselves are not prepared to face up to the difficulties their banks have in terms of the need to recapitalize.
So if bailing out the banks wasn't the right option to pick, what should they have done?
Well, they should look at Iceland, let its banks go. Now, you know, I think that I'm not saying that they should walk away from those Irish banks, but I do believe that every bondholder should take a haircut first before any Irish worker is asked to take it. Because if you don't do that, you're eventually going to find yourself in a situation where Irish sovereign debt at some point down the way is going to have to be restructured. And that's what the bond market is worried about. And I don't think that had to happen. But what they're worried, again, I keep putting it in the European context. What happened is that you had Ireland, and the bond market looked at it and said, you know, this is not tenable. This is not going to work out the way where we are being told. And then all of a sudden they look at Portugal. Well, all of a sudden, and it doesn't take long after Portugal, they look at Spain or they look at Belgium. And that's what the Europeans are facing up to. And I believe the reason for it was when the American banks, who got into a lot of difficulty, were recapitalizing, the European banks brought in a series of stress tests that everybody knew were not sufficient, and they didn't recapitalize. And until they're prepared to deal with that issue, I think we're going to see this kind of a problem continue.
Well, tell me this, and I don't mean this to sound like as naive a question as it may sound, but at what point did we start living in a world where the interests of bondholders became more important than the interests of citizens who end up paying all the bills anyway?
Well, I think that I think that's a good question. I think that up until you reach a certain point, that people should pay their debts, and I think that if you borrow from somebody, you should pay them back. And I think that's always been the situation. The problem that's occurred as a result of you know, of the incredibly inadequate regulation of banks and the very bad bets that banks made in the United States and in Europe, we got ourselves into situations where the banks got themselves into so much trouble that in fact they had to be recapitalized. The Europeans didn't do it, and as a result, they made the decision that the bondholders in those banks come first. Now, why did they make that decision? Because the European countries were worried about their own sovereign debts, and they were worried about the fact that the banks, if they put all that money into the banks, then the sovereign balance sheets would look very bad. That means interest rates would go up, and that would affect their banks. In fact, we're seeing that happen right now. That's essentially what's happening when people are looking at Spain and wondering what's going to happen in the case of Spain.
Mr. Martin, we've got a lot of new Canadians who watch this program, and many of them did not live in this country what was it now? I guess back in the middle 1990s when you were Minister of Finance. So I want to just do a bit of a history lesson, if I can, here, and see if there aren't any lessons for Ireland as well, as we look back at what you did when you had your hand on the financial tiller of the country, if I can put it that way. This country had a $42 billion deficit, which doesn't sound that high when you consider we're at 55 today, but of course it was a much smaller budget back then. And you imposed some deficit reduction measures, and basically you had most of the Canadian public behind you on that. And I guess the first question is, how did you do that?
Well, essentially, for a year before we brought down that budget, I went across the country. We had open consultations right across the country. We made sure that labor unions were at the table with business, with the table with educators and everything else, so that the Canadian public could see that there were no easy decisions here, that everybody was going to have to come to the table and nobody could be exempted. And effectively, Canadians understood that, and so when we acted, they were not surprised, and they knew that there was a higher gain, because what we were saying here is, we're not doing this to please the bankers. We're doing this to make sure that our social programs can continue to be funded, and that the next generation doesn't have to pick up this generation's problems or pay this generation's grocery bills. And then what happened is we set out a series of targets, deficit targets, and we beat those deficit targets, and so Canadians could see that this is a game that they could win. My biggest fear was, as I said at the beginning of the program, is that a major financial crisis would come and would make it impossible for us to move. And that's why it was so important that we move as quickly as we possibly could. And in fact, it paid off. I would have hated to have had an escalating deficit when the Asian crisis hit us 2 years later. I can tell you, we could have found ourselves in a very difficult situation in Canada. But essentially, Canadians put their shoulder to the wheel, and they made it a great national effort, and it paid off.
In fact, if I remember the polling of the time, you could have gone further, harder, and tougher in that first budget, but didn't. Am I right about that?
Well, yes, although, you know, the fact is that we essentially said we were going to get the deficit down in half in about 3 years, and we actually eliminated it in 4, and we started building surpluses. So I think our judgment was pretty well right. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think Canadians really wanted to win this battle. And I think the strongest reason is the intergenerational question. People didn't want to pass it on to their children. I certainly argued that, and I found that that really resonated.
Let me throw a couple of other things on the table here, comparing what the Irish are going through today with what you tried to do back a generation ago. Economic growth rates in Canada were not bad back then compared to where they are today. The Fed and the Bank of Canada, in the U.S. and here respectively, had interest rates relatively low. You had, as Brian Mulrooney likes to remind us all the time, the goods and services tax, which he put in. He likes to tell people that without that, you'd have been up a tree when it came to deficit reduction. And it was at 7%, not 5%, which is where Stephen Harper's got it. You also had, am I tiring you out here with this list? I'm going to do one more thing. You also had in opposition, not a party, angry at you for cuts, but you had the Reform Party, which was after you to cut harder, faster, stronger. So I wonder if all of that, is any of that comparable to what the Irish are going through today in terms of helping them get to where they eventually need to get to?
Yeah, just one slight qualification. Brian Mulrooney always used to say that he seeded the garden, to which my response was no, but he provided the fertilizer. But
Touche, okay.
No, the fact of the matter is that the situation was different then. I was very worried about a financial crisis hitting it, and the bad one did hit us 2 years later. And I was also worried, and all the economists were saying there was going to be a recession in the United States. And if that had hit us at any point, we would have been in trouble. And so I wanted to move well ahead of that. Now, the fact is the Irish are facing austerity budgets in the United Kingdom. They're a major customer. Austerity budgets throughout Europe. An awful lot of uncertainty in the world. When we acted, we had the worst situation of any G7 country outside of Italy. And people said, that's awful. Well, in retrospect, if you're going to deal with this kind of an issue, you're probably better off when your neighbors are in better financial shape than in worse financial shape. And that's the problem that the Irish face, which is very different than what I faced.
Let's also talk about the banks for a second, because while the Americans were deregulating their banks to the nth degree back then, we didn't do that in this country. And I wonder if you, and of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Our banks survived the last couple of years so much better than the American banks and many banks in other countries as well. Can you give us some insight into some of the discussions you had at that time as to why you didn't deregulate as hard, as fast, as strongly as, say, the Americans did?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I remember the meetings at those G7 finance ministers when they were all deregulating, and they were sort of looking at us and say, why aren't you playing this important game? Well, we only had 6 major banks, not the thousands that they have in the United States or the hundreds that they have in some of these other countries, and we could not afford to let one of those banks go. And so we had to be more secure. The second thing is, when I became finance minister, I had been in business for the previous, much of the previous decade and a half, and we went through a series of very small bank failures in Canada, trust company failures, and this kind of thing, and I was very conscious of what could happen if a major financial institution went down. In fact, the first file on my desk was the failure of Confederation Life, a major Canadian insurance company, the day I walked in and became finance minister. So it was very clear to us that we could not allow our banking system to find itself in that difficulty. In fact, so when they were deregulating, we actually tightened up the regulations. I want to say one thing as well, that you know, and the governor of the Bank of Canada at the time will tell you, as well as the deputy minister, the Canadian banks did not put a lot of pressure on us. The Canadian banks were incredibly responsible. We've been very lucky to have good management in our banks. And so at the time that we tightened up, when everybody else was deregulating, in fact, I did not get a lot of pressure, because they understood, after we met with them, that, look, you know, this is the way it was going to be. We had another one great advantage, and that is we have a single bank regulator, financial institutions, unlike the United States where they have a multiplicity of regulators. And that regulator is appointed for a term. He or she is independent. And I think that I really think that's a model other people should follow.
Let me ask you about your old pal Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, and how out on a book tour, as you were, I think, a year or two ago, and came by here. He seems to be very much opposed to the current tack taken by the British government, which is a very intense austerity program. He thinks it's exactly the wrong way to go. Where are you on this?
Well, I think that the United Kingdom had to really tighten its belt. I've been over in the United Kingdom. I actually find that, you know, Gordon Brown's successor and Miliband and the current coalition government are not that far apart in what had to be done. And if you look at what Labour was talking about when Gordon was Prime Minister, there's a difference, but it's not as great as you see. That being said, I've got to tell you, I think that Gordon Brown, when at the London G20 summit, which is the summit that essentially made the world work together, I think Gordon Brown is one of the main reasons we didn't have a global depression. And
yet, the British public didn't exactly see it that way, did they?
No, you know, and I think that obviously local politics often plays a greater role in these kinds of elections, but I don't think there's any doubt that history is going to treat Gordon Brown very, very well.
That's often what they say about politicians for whom the present is not all that much fun. You ever wonder why that is?
Well, I think I guess what happens, I think, is history is able to take a greater perspective, and the kinds of things that people do. Most good things that governments do, in fact, don't have an immediate effect. You know, they're shown much later. And so I think that you know, I think with the G20 as an example, which we worked so hard on, I think it's taken a long time before people really appreciate it. I think that essentially, if what you do is to govern for the headlines, then the historians are going to treat you very badly because you won't make the right decisions. And I think that if you govern for really the longer term good, then eventually I think that your reward comes. You're probably 6 feet under when it happens, but that's the way it is.
Let me, in our last minute, then ask you one last question, and that is, in a globalized world where bondholders, as you've pointed out, are so much, I was going to say so much more powerful than actually national governments. I guess we could argue about that, but they seem to be in ascendancy right now. Do we have to rethink this whole notion of what a country's sovereignty is really all about?
Well, yes, I do. I think we do, but not for that reason. First of all, governments are only subject to the bondholders if, in fact, governments have mishandled their economy and they've gotten themselves into a lot of difficulty. If you're not in difficulty, then the bondholders want to lend money to you, and they want to do it at a very low rate. So I think that's a choice that governments make in terms of the kind of government that they're going to provide. Do we have to change the definition of sovereignty? Absolutely. Sovereignty historically was defined as my sovereign rights. And today, I think we've got to talk about my sovereign duties, because our economies are so interdependent, and that if I don't really realize, look, we all got thrown off because American banks were badly regulated and European banks were badly regulated. They had a duty to properly regulate them, and because they didn't, they infringed on our sovereignty. And so I think that we've got to talk much more about sovereign duties than we do about sovereign rights, if in fact the world of today is going to function.
Mr. Martin, as always, it's a great pleasure to have you on the program. I hope you'll come back and visit us again. And if you want, you can bring your old pal Gordon Brown with you. We'd love to talk to both of you together.
I'd love to do that.
Okay, it'd be our pleasure. Thanks so much again, sir.
All right. Take care.